There is a house in America which has been scorched by every summer sun and buried under many feet of winter snow for over 360 years. This is the Fairbanks house in Dedham, Massachusetts, built in 1636, and it still speaks to us today. This is the story of one of the few buildings left over from the beginnings of New England, from the efforts of one family who came from Yorkshire in the north of England to settle on the outskirts of the small settlements of Boston and Watertown in a place now called Dedham. It is the story of the Fairbanks house beside the old post road which led to New York and Philadelphia and then on further south. The Fairbanks house and the old post road are two well-known landmarks of this old village. The house was built about 1636 by Jonathan and Grace Smith Fairbanks, who came from England across the Atlantic Ocean with others, packed like sardines in small sailing ships. Jonathan and his wife Grace brought their children with them. There was John, who was probably about 15 years old, George, who may have been about 12 or 13 years old, Mary, who was 11, and Susan, Jonas, and Jonathan Jr., who were even younger. They came to make a new home for themselves in the Massachusetts Bay Colony known today as part of New England. With the help of his family, Jonathan started to build. He built a fine house, one that has stood the test of time and become known as the oldest frame house in America that has had the least amount of remodeling, one of the best examples of 17th century architecture in America. The children finished growing up here, and when the older boy married, parts were added to the house on either side for a home for him and his growing family. The others married and moved away, but brought their children home to this house to see their grandparents while they lived. Come inside and see the rooms that they would have known and loved. Here is where the family would have gathered for homecoming hugs and greetings, and to eat the meals prepared in this kitchen before the visitors arrived, using the equipment that is so different from today, which can be studied more closely during a tour of the house in person. There is always a knowledgeable guide to show visitors around. They would have sat around in this parlor afterwards, catching up on all the neighborhood news and discussing the village politics of the day. This part of the addition was made into a parlor for John and his wife to use, separate from the rest of the family. This added ground floor room displays a four-poster bed with a canopy for holding in the warmth. A cradle of that time period shows care for the coming generations. This was a family bedroom in the original house on the second floor, and it's filled with items collected over the years and carefully preserved, worth examining in detail during a personal tour. Another bedroom filled with 17th and 18th century items. Note the trundle bed available for additional sleeping space. This was an addition on the first floor, used for storing milk and making cheese, and a place to put up the spinning wheels and looms for making cloth. Many types of interesting hand tools are on display for visitors to examine closely in order to understand life in the 17th and 18th centuries. The grandchildren never saw the homeland in Yorkshire at all, but those who were born there never forgot their friends or the sights of the moors and the sounds of the villages. They missed being able to care for the graves of their ancestors in the familiar shady churchyards under the spreading old trees. In the year 2000, a Fairbanks family tour was organized to take descendants of the family back to the Sowerby area of Yorkshire, to give them an idea of what the Fairbanks home country was like. The White Swan Inn, located in Thornton and Craven, one of the villages where the Fairbanks family were to be found so many years ago, is a center for hospitality and a good meeting place. This is Jim Landberg, one of the family tour group, who photographed as many areas of Fairbank territory as he could find. We'll pass along what he told us about these places. This is the front of the church at Thornton and Craven, and the back, showing a part of the cemetery and a view beyond the fence where we can see some sheep placidly grazing, the basis of the entire woolen trade carried on by many of the Fairbanks families. This is a time-worn house in Thornton and Craven, built of solid stone and guaranteed to last for centuries. Moving on, this is the Hinchcliffe Arms Inn in Clagvale. The vale runs roughly north and south between Sowerby on the east and Arrington on the west. Fairbanks lived in both places and would likely have traveled through here. This is the country church near the inn. Here's a patchwork view of fields, each section having a different purpose for the farmer in charge. A view looking down on the village of Heptonstall. A house near Heptonstall. This is the view of the church tower, taken from the graveyard behind the church, and a view out over the valley from the graveyard back of the church, what it might have looked like 360 or more years ago. This is a close-up of the houses. Notice the windows resembling those in parts of the Fairbanks house. This is the Maypole Inn in the village of Warley, which was the home village of Grace Smith Fairbank. She was raised there by her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Smith. Jonathan must have courted her in this village. Perhaps they went for walks around the moors outside the village of Warley. One of the country lanes they might have walked along in Warley, and the sort of views they would have had as they wandered together outside the village. This is Saltonstall Manor, the manor hall of the Saltonstalls, who lived in the Warley, Ludden, Midgley area. The two families of Saltonstalls and Fairbanks intermarried. A view of Upper Saltonstall Hall from the back. This is part of the second floor, which the current resident family has renovated. You can see that the windows let in the light that was needed for weaving cloth so many years ago. This is a room on the first floor which has not been restored. Again, it shows the importance of the windows to let in the light that was needed for any kind of textile or craft work. Here's a view from the backyard of the hall. The Saltonstalls likely had a leasehold on much nearby land and rented it out to area farmers. These are scenes from the other side of the valley from Warley and Ludden, on the road to Sowerby. A view of the current church at Ludden, located on the site of earlier churches built in the 16th and 17th centuries. Another Fairbank by the same name of Jonathan was the curate here from 1652 to 1662, when our Jonathan had been in New England for 30 years. This was also the area peopled by folks by the name of Gawkrogers, possible cousins from way back. Behind the Ludden Church is this small cemetery, and a sweeping view of the countryside near Ludden and Sowerby. This is a house in Sowerby, built about 1662 according to the faded date carved in the stone. Jonathan would never have seen this being built, as he had been in America for nearly 30 years. Just note the big upper windows which resemble the style he used in his house in Dedham, and note the cobblestone pavement in front. Present Sowerby Village with its large bridge. This is the Field House in Sowerby. A group of families by the name of Field immigrated from here to New England and Long Island. There were Field families in Hipperholm too, as were Fairbanks. Driving along, we come to Sowerby Bridge, where some of the Fairbanks family lived. This village was on a water route to Manchester, where the canal was used in the 16th and 17th centuries for the transshipment of produce between Manchester and the North Seaports. Here we see houseboats lined up along the docks. The entrance to the church at Sowerby Bridge. This building is only a few hundred years old. There was probably an earlier chapel here when the Fairbanks were here. The time has come to say goodbye to the American Fairbanks Tour Group. We appreciate their letting us go along with them to see what was relevant to the Fairbanks families in Yorkshire, England today, as well as so many years ago. They have shown us a beautiful country indeed. Why on earth would the early pioneers of New England want to leave such a lovely place? But things were not always like this. Let us turn back pages of the calendar, from 2000 to 1900, to 1800, to 1700, to about 1625, when Charles I was King of England. Charles I was handsome and talented in many ways, but he had a narrow and obstinate mind. He had one supreme idea, that the government was no affair of the people or of Parliament, and that the king must rule by himself alone. Members of Parliament were furious. They had fought hard for more than 200 years for freedom of speech and government by representation in Parliament, and now they had to face this. They drew up a petition of rights, saying that no tax could be levied without consent of Parliament, that no one could be imprisoned unless the charges against him were clearly stated, and that the king could not billet soldiers in private houses. So the king dismissed Parliament and ruled for 11 years by himself. The results were disastrous. Among many other problems, there was an economic depression that was hard on the woolen trade, on which Jonathan Fairbanks and many of his relatives depended for their living. Times had been changing during the last 100 years. Among other things, the Reformation had split Christianity in Europe into two groups, Roman Catholic and Protestant. Many people wanted worship services to be made simpler, wanted the church to be purified, and these persons came to be known as Puritans. They could read the scriptures for themselves and repeat the psalms and hymns instead of having organs and choirs. Archbishop Laud of the Church of England did not want any new thinking going on in his congregation. It was the law that everyone had to attend the Church of England. If they stayed home, they were considered to be guilty of disturbing the peace, and for this they could be arrested and perhaps put in jail. The people didn't know what to do. Did they dare stay home from church? There was a lot of tension building up. Leaders fought a hard battle with the king over their personal freedoms and their rights even to have a parliament. Today it seems impossible for us to think that final victory could have been with Charles, yet earnest men of the time believed that he would triumph and liberty was dead in England. To some of the Puritans, it seemed best to seek a new home across the sea, and finally about 60,000 people decided to leave. Some went across the English Channel to Holland and Germany, where there were Protestant settlements they could join along the Rhine River. Thousands more went to the West Indies, attracted by life and business on the sugar plantations. A settlement of English people in Virginia had been started in 1607 in Jamestown, and in 1620 in Plymouth by the Pilgrims who had left from Holland. Both settlements needed more people. People were also settling north of Plymouth, where there was good space around what we now know as Salem. A single ship called the Mary and John sailed early in 1630 and arrived in June, making the settlement they called Dorchester. However, the Reverend John Winthrop had been busy securing a charter from the king for a settlement all around the Boston area to be called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was busily recruiting settlers with many skills, farmers, carpenters, masons, weavers, and merchants to build a solid settlement, and educated persons who could preach, teach, and organize churches and schools. The Winthrop fleet of 17 ships, filled with intelligent people and basic supplies, arrived safely near Boston in September 1630. These ships continued to shuttle back and forth across the Atlantic until about 1642, bringing additional settlers and fresh supplies for the colonies. In 1633, we find Jonathan with his wife and family on board one of these little ships, heading for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. During the 8-week trip, they had plenty of time for second thoughts. Had they made a good decision? When the weather was stormy, they probably wished they were back home. But when the weather was calm and the ship was moving steadily westward, They probably felt that God was leading them and that He would be with them no matter what happened. By 1642, the English people had had enough of the government of King Charles I. Those who had not immigrated by then decided to stay home and join the army being raised in revolt against him, led by Oliver Cromwell. After much fighting, King Charles I was defeated, and he was led to the block and beheaded. He was replaced by a reformed government under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. From then on, the Puritans were content to stay in England under improved conditions. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Indians were not happy with the English, and they fought hard to drive them out. In spite of land treaties, all the Fairbanks boys and their neighbors were involved for years in protecting their homes. There was a massacre at the Prescott settlement in Lancaster in 1676. Jonas was killed, and his small cabin burned to the ground, leaving his wife Lydia and their 10 children homeless. Battles with Indians continued well into the next century. Because the new settlers were living in a British colony, Fairbanks' descendants were involved with England's 7-year war with France from 1756 to 1763, known here in America as the French and Indian War. Finally, when the decision came to separate from England, Fairbank descendants were at Lexington Green in April 1775. The Fairbanks house was 140 years old by now, but was still standing sentinel beside the old post road, which still ran beside it, connecting Boston and Philadelphia. The horse and carriage traffic along it was now carrying leaders like John Adams and his cousin Samuel and others to the State House in Philadelphia, intent upon creating a new country. Their ancestors had left England between 1620 and 1642 because they thought liberty in England was dead. They didn't want to lose it in America. By 1783, they had not lost it. The United States of America had been born. The years continued to pass, and the Fairbanks family spread out so far across the country that a descendant of Jonas, Lorenzo Sales Fairbanks, could see how hard it was going to be to keep track of the future families. He began to collect family records so thoroughly that he became the first official family historian. He added much more to what had already been written, and was compiling a large Fairbank genealogy book, but he ran out of strength when it was almost done and died. However, he had an able assistant in a cousin, the historian and lecturer John Wilder Fairbank, also a descendant of Jonas of Lancaster, who completed the genealogy and had it printed. John also continued gathering family data by mail, long after it was too late to have the records added to his book and his work paid off. For instance, he had been looking for records of his cousin, James Fairbank of Putney, Vermont, and finally found him with his son, Willard Fairbank, a pioneer in Elma Township in Erie County, New York. Beside his son Willard, there was his daughter, Nancy Fairbank Blood, and her family, and his daughter, Laura Fairbank Blood, and her family. From this lost clan who found their way back to Dedham through the efforts of John Wilder Fairbank came people who grew to be very dedicated to the preservation of the old homestead. From Nancy came Arthur and Miriam Blood, who became excellent curators of the house, who were trained by longtime curator Miss Ethel Freeman, a Fairbanks descendant. And from Willard came the creators of this video, Robert Fairbank Cline, Doris Cline Ward, and Jacqueline Ward Britton. Stories that fortunately had been contributed to the book show not only how the individual families grew and prospered, but how we contributed to the development of the whole country. By carrying on the skills and techniques handed down by the early settlers, Fairbanks created hundreds of products through small business enterprises. An example was Alfred Gary Fairbanks. A descendant of John of Dedham, Alfred was born in New Hampshire and went from a career first as a blacksmith, then as a farmer, and then came to operate a grocery store. Along the way, he became active in politics from the ground level on up, and finally advanced to state senator for New Hampshire. Thaddeus Fairbanks of Vermont, descendant of Jonathan's son George, had an interest in blacksmithing, which led to the invention of the Fairbanks platform scales. In partnership with his brother, Erastus Fairbanks, the firm of E&T Fairbanks became very successful. The skill in business management finally took Erastus to being governor of Vermont in the early 1860s. His son, Horace Fairbanks, in the next generation, followed him to the same job of governor of Vermont after years of administrative experience in the family business. Together with his brother, Franklin Fairbanks, the family was able to endow the city of St. Johnsbury with a fine art gallery and public library called the Athenaeum. Wilson Henry Fairbank, a descendant of Jonas, was helping his father in the lumbering business when the telegraph was invented. He ended up holding a contract to supply telephone poles for the area between New York and Philadelphia. Nathaniel Kellogg Fairbanks, who descended from Jonas, started as a bricklayer's apprentice in Rochester, New York, and went to Chicago in the grain commission business. He prospered and finally built a refinery for lard and oil. Along the way, he helped with the erection of a central music hall building. Still more business enterprises kept the family moving west. Hiram Tolbert Fairbanks, descendant of John, moving from Indiana to Iowa and then to California, establishing businesses along the way, eventually establishing the Golden Eagle Flour Mill that brought growth and prosperity to Petaluma, California. The Reverend Calvin Fairbanks was a Methodist minister who violated the codes of Kentucky and Virginia before being arrested for steering 40 slaves to freedom through the Underground Railway. The price he paid for following a higher law of God was 17 years in jail and hard labor. He was pardoned in 1864 by the Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky. From the Fairbanks house, descending through George, came Abel Whitmore Fairbanks, who started the Cleveland Herald newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio, and was deeply involved in the national and political issues of the day. Also out of Ohio came an attorney by the name of Charles Warren Fairbanks, in the 8th generation from Jonathan through Jonas. He moved to Indiana, where he soon took an active part in the state Republican Party. In 1897, this took him to a seat in the U.S. Senate. In 1904, just a few years after the Fairbanks genealogy was published in 1898, Fairbanks, Alaska was named for him. Senator Fairbanks went on to become vice president under President Theodore Roosevelt. The House has watched silently during the 20th century as each new family member has ridden off down new roads, leading to new accomplishments and new contributions to their families and their country. Since 1898, great things have been accomplished by Fairbanks descendants, but their links to the earlier people are in danger of being lost. Hundreds of marriages, births, and deaths have been collected and are available for research, but along with them, the Fairbanks House calls for the stories of the accomplishments of the 20th and 21st centuries to be gathered back under the old roof tree as well. Maintaining that account, century after century, would continue to vindicate the faith in the future professed by Jonathan and Grace Smith Fairbanks when they decided to bring their children with them in a frail little boat across the stormy ocean to make a start in a new world. The Fairbanks House, standing beside the old post road in Dedham, shows all the world what it was like to live in the 17th century. It invites all Fairbanks descendants to become active members of the Fairbanks family in America and to come home for the summer reunions and meet their cousins.